They opened the file in silence. A brittle, sun-faded jacket labeled AIR Ministry, eyes only. Malta, initial air defense, slid across the table like an artifact from another world. Inside were 3 photographs, grainy, overexposed prints showing a trio of outdated biplanes. The notes beneath them carried no drama, only a technical classification. Gloucester Gladiator MKI obsolete, limited service value. Yet the penciled annotation scrawled in the margin told another truth entirely. These 3 aircraft delayed the fall of Malta. For decades after the Second World War ended, veterans whispered the story in fragments. How 3 obsolete machines, relics of the 1930s, faced a modern air fleet bent on annihilation. How they responded not with superiority but with resilience. How they flew day after day, turning a fortress island's expected destruction into stubborn survival. This is the forgotten record of how 3 biplanes, later named Faith, Hope, and Charity, stood between Malta and defeat for months. The war arrived abruptly. Europe in 1940 was carved by advancing armies, shattered cities, and soldiers struggling through ruined streets. Across the continent, mechanized divisions surged forward under banners of lightning war. Tanks rolled over borders with terrifying speed, their treads grinding into the soil of nations that had never imagined such rapid collapse. As France fell and Britain prepared for invasion, the Mediterranean became a crucible. Whoever controlled it would command the routes to North Africa, the Middle East, and the lifeline to India. In that vast chessboard, Malta, a speck of land south of Sicily, was a critical piece. Malta was small, exposed, and dangerously under-defended. It was a limestone fortress left behind by history, valuable only because of its position. The British command knew it, the Italians feared it, and the Germans would learn it. For Mussolini, Malta was an insult, a British dagger aimed at the heart of Italian supply routes to Libya. The island had only a handful of anti-aircraft guns, a few naval units, and almost no air power. In Rome, planners predicted that Malta would fall within a week. In June 1940, when Italy declared war on Britain and France, the first assault came swiftly. Italian bombers lifted from airfields in Sicily, their formations visible against the Mediterranean sky. They expected no resistance. British intelligence expected no resistance. Even Malta's own defenders expected none. The island's 2 airfields held no modern fighters. Only a crate of disassembled Gloucester Gladiator biplanes, older than some of the men ordered to fly them, sat in storage, their wings folded like moths waiting for dusk. A few technicians, acting on instinct more than instruction, assembled 3 of the Gladiators and coaxed their radial engines back to life. The first coughs of ignition echoed across the hangar like a relic waking from sleep. No one believed these machines would matter. They were slow, lightly armed, and fragile, canvas and aluminum in a world now ruled by steel and speed. Yet on that first day of attack, when the skies darkened with incoming bombers, there was no alternative. What happened next became part of Malta's mythology. 3 obsolete biplanes rose into a sky ruled by a modern air fleet. For the Italian pilots trained to expect unopposed bombing runs, the sight was surreal, like encountering ghosts from an earlier war. But the Gladiators climbed straight toward them, wings braced against the turbulence of higher modern aircraft. Their machine guns rattled in short, precise bursts. The bombers dispersed, their formation broken. Some turned back, others jettisoned their bombs early. The raid still caused damage, but the island lived. It had not been defenseless. Day after day, battle raged. Soldiers on the ground dug trenches through brown earth and sharp stone, preparing for the next wave of air assault. Tanks rolled across Europe, unstoppable and indifferent to human fear. But Malta's defenders faced an enemy from above, one that struck without warning. The gladiators, with their open cockpits and fabric-covered frames, seemed like artifacts from the First World War reborn in the Second. But their pilots learned quickly. The biplanes could outturn the faster Italian fighters. Their compact size made them difficult to hit. Their vintage construction let them absorb punishment modern fighters could not. From the island's coastal batteries, sailors watched dogfights that felt impossible. Slow spirals of endurance against the lightning dives of Machi and Fiat aircraft. Each time the gladiators rose, they bought Malta a few more hours. The RAF personnel on the ground printed brief communiques that attempted to maintain morale. The local newspapers, already strained by shortages and bomb shock, reported them with astonishment. Malta's fighters engage enemy again. But fighters was a generous term. They were, in truth, relics. Then the sea war arrived. In the Mediterranean, naval convoys fought through minefields, air attacks, and the ever-present threat of submarines. Ships burned on the horizon, casting smoke across harbors already pitted with bomb craters. Malta served as a critical observation post. From its cliffs, British spotters tracked Italian naval movements and transmitted coded reports to operations rooms in Alexandria and London. These transmissions, sent through static and interference, were lifelines, providing intelligence on convoys supplying Italian forces in Libya. That intelligence mattered. The North African campaign was a knife-edge contest of logistics. If Malta fell, Axis supply lines to Rommel would be free of harassment. If Malta survived, it would continue to slice through the arteries that kept the Africa Corps alive. Churchill would later call Malta the unsinkable aircraft carrier. But in 1940 it was barely afloat. It survived partly because 3 biplanes held off a fleet long enough for reinforcement to arrive. The Air Ministry could not believe the reports. Modern fighters from the 1930s had difficulty against Italian forces, yet here were gladiators, slower, obsolete, driving off raiders repeatedly. Fighter formations multiplied in the sky, weaving lines of exhaust against clouds made thin by summer heat. The Italians altered tactics, attacking at night or in larger waves. The gladiators responded when they could, pilots rotating between missions with only minutes of rest. The bombings left the island cities in ruins. Valletta's limestone walls scorched, hospitals overflowing, neighborhoods reduced to rubble. Civilians ran through the streets carrying bundles of cherished belongings. The Mediterranean sun reflected against shattered windows. Already Malta's civilian population was facing starvation, shortages, and ceaseless fear. Yet every time the biplanes launched, islanders gathered to watch. They nicknamed them Faith, Hope, and Charity. The names stuck, becoming symbols as much as aircraft. When all 3 flew, crowds cheered. When one was damaged, mechanics worked through the night under lantern light, patching holes with fabric, tightening wires, replacing spark plugs scavenged from spare engines. Radio operators intercepted Italian communications, relaying coded updates through underground rooms carved into limestone. Young telegraphists worked through dust and tremor as bombs fell above them. Sometimes the operators would hear a gladiator pilot cutting through the static, describing enemy positions or requesting support. These voices became familiar, thin, clipped, steady. They carried the strain of impossible duty. Above them, Red Cross nurses hurried along corridors filled with smoke and wounded men. Malta's hospitals were at capacity, their windows sandbagged, their staff exhausted. Pilots who were shot down were often treated next to the civilians who had watched them fight minutes earlier. Victory and suffering shared the same wards. By the autumn of 1940, the Mediterranean campaign was escalating. Generals in London pored over maps marked with naval losses, convoy routes, and frontline positions in North Africa. They saw Malta not as an isolated outpost, but as a hinge upon which entire operations could turn. They debated how long the island could hold and how much air power would be needed to reinforce it. But reinforcement depended on convoys, and convoys depended on ships surviving the gauntlet of submarines patrolling the sea lanes. German U-boats had entered the Mediterranean by then. Their commanders saw Malta as a beacon of danger, a hub for Allied reconnaissance aircraft that reported their positions. Submarines stalked the waters aggressively, their torpedoes striking supply ships bound for the island. Each loss meant less fuel, fewer bullets, fewer chances for Malta's survival. The job of the gladiators was no longer merely to intercept bombers. They had become symbols of defiance in a larger naval war fought above and below the surface. Winter arrived, bringing cold and hunger. Civilians sheltered in ancient catacombs as bombs thundered against the island's surface. Snow never fell on Malta, but the winter of 1940-1941 felt cold in other ways. Cold with fear, cold with exhaustion. Soldiers on the ground watched the skies anxiously, listening for the familiar hum of the gladiators. Their presence had become a psychological anchor in a season of uncertainty. By early 1941, victory across Europe belonged largely to the Axis. Yet Malta still stood. Reinforcements eventually arrived, Hurricanes, then Spitfires, but their arrival was made possible only because the island was not already in enemy hands. The gladiators had bought the critical months that made reinforcement feasible. Celebrations erupted not just on Malta but in Britain, where newspapers framed the island as a symbol of resistance. The defenders had endured near constant assault and still refused to yield. Berlin and Rome reacted with anger. Massive raids targeted Valletta and its surrounding towns. Streets were turned into fields of rubble. Ancient buildings collapsed. Civilian casualties mounted. But Malta's spirit hardened. Women joined factory crews manufacturing parts, repairing radios, and organizing food distribution. The line between civilian and soldier blurred. Artillery boomed across the island as the war intensified. Anti-aircraft batteries worked without pause, tracking incoming aircraft at every hour. Pilots of the new arrivals, more advanced fighters, learned that their earliest inspiration had come from 3 biplanes built in an era before radar, before pressurized cockpits, before warfare became a calculated science. D-Day planning officers thousands of miles away studied lessons from Malta to understand how air superiority could be denied by ingenuity, discipline, and morale. Malta proved that an outnumbered air force could hold if its defenders exploited terrain, timing, and psychology. It became a case study in resilience. As bombers continued to roar overhead in the final years of the war, Malta remained battered but unbroken. The island would receive the George Cross for collective heroism. One of the gladiators, Faith, survived. Its fuselage, riddled with bullet holes, was preserved after the war as a symbol of defiance. Malta's ruins were cleared slowly after 1945, the debris of war swept away by hands that had lived through its worst moments. Women who had worked in factories returned to their families. Bomb craters became foundations for new buildings. Malta rebuilt itself stone by stone, memory by memory. Yet the story of the gladiators did not fade. It remained alive in the recollections of pilots and civilians, in intelligence archives, and in the whisper of old engines fired for ceremonial flights decades later. Military academies study the Siege of Malta as a lesson in asymmetric air defense. Strategists cite the gladiators as proof that technology alone does not determine victory. Willpower matters, and sometimes a relic can change the fate of a campaign. The legacy of the 3 biplanes is more than mechanical. It is human. It is the story of pilots who climbed into fragile machines with no guarantee of return. Mechanics who patched wings in darkness. civilians who carried on while the sky itself seemed to fall, radio operators whose calm voices held the island's nerves together, and an island that became the most bombed place of the Second World War, yet refused to collapse. In the end, history recorded the Siege of Malta as a turning point. It shaped the Mediterranean War, influenced the North African campaign, and tested the limits of endurance. But buried within that larger story is the quieter truth: how 3 obsolete machines flown by determined men bought time when time was the only currency that mattered. For months they held the line. For months they rose into a sky they had no right to command. And long after the war ended, their courage remained an echo across the Mediterranean, a testament to a simple fact. Even in the darkest hours of the Second World War, hope can take flight on the most unlikely wings.